No joke, Planning Center has a secret Super Mario-like video game built into the software. Don't believe me? Next time you're using Planning Center, use your computer keyboard to enter the Nintendo Konami cheat code, which is up, up, down, down, left, right, BA. You'll then be taken to a hidden video game, and you can enjoy sweet procrastination. Besides hidden video games, Planning Center is truly the best way to plan, schedule, and resource your teams for your upcoming services. It's the most powerful service planning software I've ever seen, and yet it's incredibly intuitive, easy to use, and super flexible to meet the needs of any size church, no matter how big and complex or small and simple. If you're not using Planning Center, you're making your life way more complicated than it needs to be. Try it for free for 30 days, and then plans start at just $14 a month. You can check all this out at planning.center. Planning.center. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Worship Ministry Training Podcast, a monthly podcast for worship leaders. Last month, we talked to a few worship leaders at a church of 35,000. And while megachurches are becoming more common through things like multi-site strategies, most churches are much, much smaller. In fact, the average church size in America is 70 people. And churches in many other countries are even smaller than that. And so the reality is, for most worship leaders, they are working with very limited resources, both personnel and financial. But size shouldn't dictate the quality with which we serve the Lord. God wants us to faithfully shepherd the people He's put in our purview, and He's sovereignly and wisely assigned each of us to the different groups that He chose. The key is to do the best you can with what you've been given. The challenge for worship leaders in smaller churches is that they have less to work with. But if you think about the parable of the talents, the servant who was given fewer coins was still able to multiply them and present them back to the master in a better state than when he was given them. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the unique challenges that small churches face and their corresponding solutions. I'm going to be talking with Andrea Olson, who runs the Overflow Worship Conference in the Midwest. She has been working with small to mid-sized churches for almost a decade, training them and developing their worship teams to bring the best they can with what they have. So she is very aware of the challenges that smaller churches face. I also did an episode a few years back called Holding High Standards in Small Churches with Cade Young, which I'll link in the show notes. If you know any worship leaders who'd be helped by these topics, please forward these episodes onto them along with an encouraging word. All right, let's jump right into the interview with Andrea Olson. Hey everybody, I am here with Andrea Olson, who is the director of the Overflow Worship Conference, a regional conference in the Midwest that trains worship teams and worship leaders. Hey Andrea, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. It's early and I haven't had coffee, but I am awake, so excited to chat with you.
Yeah, I'm excited too. I did get my coffee though. I wish I could share it with you.
That's all right. So, Andrea, you've worked with a lot of mid-sized and smaller-sized churches in the Midwest. You go there with your family, you do training workshops with different teams, and I feel like you probably have a really strong understanding of the unique challenges and the problems that smaller churches face. And so that's why you're on today, is to help listeners in mid-sized and smaller-sized churches do the very best they can with what they have. So I want to just start kind of with a blanket question that you can kind of brain dump all your answers, and then we'll dig into each of those separately in a little bit. But
Okay.
What are some of the common problems that you see in worship teams of small churches? Like, what are the, 3, 4, 5, or 6 core issues that you continually run into when you're out training these different churches?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And, I get a lot of different questions, but it's interesting how I see common themes, throughout the different places that I visit. And one of the biggest ones is personnel. So, people ask me, like, how do we thrive with, only 2 or 3 people on our worship team, or how do we draw more people in? And so that's a big issue. And I think one of the things that we need to address with that is how to thrive with what you have first, and, then how to train up more people. And so then the following challenge is, what do we do with beginner worship team members? How do we train them? How do we, bring them from either a place of the very, very beginning, or from a place of, maybe they've played classically or in different types of settings, and how to bring it into the worship context. Another question I get a lot of is we don't have the resources that we need, whether it's money or, like I said already, personnel, or it's sound equipment, instruments, that kind of thing. So a lot of times it's very practical things like, hey, what keyboard do you recommend? Or, those kinds of things. And the last one that is kind of in the forefront of my mind is a question of what is our, I guess it starts as, what is our sound? Like, who do we sound like? Are we supposed to sound like this recording? Like, some of these amazing worship bands out there that are putting out amazing music for the church. It's great for the church, but there's a disconnect between translating from the album and then into the local church context. And so what do we do with that? So those are kind of the big questions that I get a lot.
That's great. And I love the last one. I'm kind of surprised by that because that's something that I've been talking about with a few of my close friends is like, do we all have to sound the same? And the answer is no. Like, we are a unique individual body of believers, and we should sound like us and play like us and be like us, So I'm excited to talk about that. You mentioned the personnel problem being the forefront, not having a lot of options in a small church. So what would you say to a listener about how to build a team that is limited in, you've got, let's say, 80 people in the church. How do you build a team with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first thing I always like to address is, focusing on what you have and really working to be excellent with that. I think a lot of times it's easy for us, whether it's in a church context or in life in general, we kind of look at what everybody else has and think like, well, if we had that, we would be fine, or, we could do better. And so that's kind of the first stop for me when I'm working with churches, is to say, okay, let's look at what you have. Let's utilize it. If it's 2 people, then let's work with that, because you can be excellent with that. You can be excellent with what you have. And that's kind of a mantra that I use all the time everywhere that I go. And so I really believe that God honors that when we say, okay, God, thank you for what you've given us. And I'm going to be grateful for it. And I'm going to work to thrive in it and to steward this well. And then from there, I really believe that God honors and blesses that. And he begins to maybe change your heart and your mindset about it, and looking at what you've got and being grateful for it. And then once you start to build it, and once you start to look at, okay, maybe there are some things we can do logistically, you can look at technology. There are easy things like adding pads through an iPad or a phone even, and to fill out your sound. If you just don't have an extra person and you really want to fill that sound, you can use multi-tracks, that kind of thing. But I don't skip over the fact that there's beauty and simplicity too. Like, you can have the multi-tracks, you can have the full band. And sometimes when I go to a church and I step in because the worship leader just is going to be gone, or they need a Sunday off, or they want to give their team a Sunday off, sometimes I will use multi-tracks and have kind of this band sound, but other times I don't. And it's just me and the piano, and there's beauty in that simplicity. So I think embracing, what God's given you first is key. And then you can look at technology. And then from a practical standpoint, start asking God to bring people and to show you, okay, Lord, this person who sits in the 3rd row every single Sunday and they seem like they can sing, maybe just start praying for that person and praying about, how to approach it. And you will be shocked and amazed at what the Lord begins to do when you kind of start to shift your focus and start praying for those people and praying for the Lord to open doors to, draw the right people in.
Yeah, because you don't want the wrong people either. So don't rush just because you're like, oh my gosh, I've got nobody, so I'll take anybody, and then it's a hot mess, And I think you're so right about the whole beauty and simplicity thing. I feel like a lot of times when you strip it back and you allow room for the congregational voice, people worship more and they sing more and they're more engaged, instead of watching this amazing flashy band. I mean, I'm not opposed to amazing flashy bands. We have a big band most Sundays, but a lot of times when you go back to just the acoustic thing, it opens up just this room for the church to engage and feel like we are a part of this. We can hear ourselves sing. And so I love that encouragement to not count out the power of the acoustic thing. So that's really cool. Do you think that the listeners should go outside of the walls of the church to look for talent? if they're desperate, or should they just stick to what's there and build on that and pray that God would bring other people?
That's such an interesting question. And it's something actually that I have dealt with a lot in the last, 5 to 7 years as the ministry of Overflow Worship has kind of grown into what it is today. But I would say it can be a mixture of both, and it really depends on the vision of that church body and kind of the mission of that church body. So for example, there is a church that is about 3.5 hours away from where we live, and they have invited me to come in to work with their team, kind of do a workshop and help train them. And then I've led worship alongside of them. But then also they've brought me in as just a worship leader to give their team a Sunday off. And so I'm in that position of being that outside person. And I think it can be valuable. But then there's also the struggle of if the mindset is, well, we have to because we can't do it without drums, or we have to because we can't do it without this, instrument. Then I think that is where the issue comes in, and where, we kind of need to check our hearts and our focus and our vision, because you don't need a drummer. I mean, they're great. I love having drums. But if it becomes an obstacle for us, that it's like, oh no, we don't have a drummer, what are we going to do? I think we need to shift our focus and ask a different question. And so I definitely don't think there's any issue with going outside the church walls, but it can be tricky because you also don't want to be pulling from other ministries that it might be hard for them that if they're losing their drummer or their bass player. So it has to be, kind of a unified vision within the leadership, and then asking the right question of, are we doing this because it will really benefit the church body and it will benefit the vision that God's placed on our heart? Or is it because we think we just are supposed to have a drummer? Then maybe you want to ask a different question.
Yeah, I love that question. What are we going to do without a drummer? Well, we're going to worship. That's what we're going to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Nobody's going to not worship because there's no drummer. So yeah, that's great. Yes. I also did want to say something too. Like, I think, we don't have a drummer. I do think there are ways to get creative where it's like, well, maybe you can use a kick drum on your right foot while you play your guitar, and like, so, we have a lot of musicians at our church, but I am going to do a Sunday in a couple weeks. Well, by the time this podcast airs, it'll already be past, but whatever. Where we're going to do an acoustic set. It's just going to be me on my acoustic and my kick drum and some strong vocalists. So even with what you have, can you improve even that and expand upon that? Like, try putting a kick drum on your foot, and maybe, like you said, a backing pad, which we do have a sponsorship with Core Sound pads. So everybody check out Core Sound. It's like taking what you have first and expanding it to the furthest degree possible. Maybe you have a tambourine on your other foot. No, I'm just kidding. But like, it's like, let's do that first before we go seek other people to come in and add to that. But now going to the training side of things, let's say it's me, a piano player, I'm playing the kick drum with my foot. Now, how do I take the piano player and the vocalist who can only sing melody with me, and what do I do now? How do I train those people?
I think the first thing that I like to address is just understanding roles, like understand your role within the worship team. So, for example, I was at a church a couple of months ago doing a workshop with their team, and it was interesting because they had a church pianist. This was a more traditional congregation, and so she was like playing full on the sheet music, and they were trying to figure out how to they don't want to lose her. She's wonderful. But she was feeling this tension of like, I don't really know what to do anymore because there's a keyboard player and an acoustic guitar player, and I'm just kind of here. And so it was a matter of helping her understand her role in this new band. And so, for this example where you said, what if it's you and this singer and a piano player? Well, first let's understand the roles. So your piano player is going to be glue, because your acoustic guitar is going to be rhythm. And so the piano player, if she's playing too much rhythm, it's going to conflict with what you're doing. And so just kind of coming at it from that perspective is a lot easier too, as opposed to like, well, I don't want you to play that there, play that. It's just a much easier, like, this is your role. It's a broader perspective. And understanding that, okay, you're the glue. So what does that mean? You're going to really help to hold the sound together and fill in those gaps. And then for a singer who only sings melody, I would say, hey, that's great. We love doubled melody, because then that gives the leader the opportunity to say something, mid-phrase, like continue to worship with us, or let's, sing that chorus again, or something like that. And it doesn't break the flow. But then understanding that even though you're melody, you're not the leader. So you want to kind of pull back your volume and sing as such. So you're blending. So those are kind of some of the things that I would say in that context to help everybody understand their role and hopefully thrive in it and feel like they're valued in what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. No, the role thing is really great. I love that. I never thought about it that way. Even like what you said, the glue, you're the glue. It's like, oh, okay, I kind of understand that concept now. And so instead of just like, no, don't play that. That doesn't sound good. They're like, why not? Well, because it's not being very glue-like, but you still want to develop them on a technical level. So let's say I'm a bivocational worship leader, I'm busy, I've got a family, whatever. Where do I find time or carve out time to train these people? And then what does training look like? Is it one-on-one, like, hey, come before or after service, let's stay, and you give them parts to work on? Or what would you do to train those 2 or 3 people on my team?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a question I should have added into the beginning as, okay, I want to train them, but like, where do I find the time? Because like you say, it's this bivocational, or they're completely volunteer worship leaders. So I would say a couple of different things. First of all, if you're the worship leader, I would say, hey, look at the next 6 months and find, maybe 2 things that you could do for your whole team. So whether that's a conference that you go, outside to an event that's already being put on by someone else. And then maybe the second one is a team training day. So maybe you bring in somebody from the outside, or maybe you can do it, or you could resource from within your body just to help train the vocalist. Maybe it's like, okay, we're going to take these 2 hours. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be a 10-hour day. We're going to take these 2 hours and we're going to learn 3 new songs. And you could give them the stuff ahead of time so that they can, learn the songs and work on it and that kind of thing. So that's a really practical, easy thing that I think is manageable for worship leaders. Like, okay, 2 in 6 months. Okay, that's 2 big team things. And then practically day to day, just little things like, maybe you could figure out an automated texting thing, or put a reminder on your phone, like once a week. Text the team with an encouragement and a, hey, here's a new song we're going to learn, or here's a cool tip video that I found for drummers. Maybe map it out of something that you could find for each person or each instrument or vocal part on your team. And you don't have to make them yourself, just go on YouTube, find something, or there's lots of great training resource websites and ministries out there. So that's something that I encourage people to do too, but just make it manageable. We get that this can't be a several hour a day thing that you're devoting to it. And then the third thing is, if you have capacity, come early to rehearsal, or stay after rehearsal, or, those types of things. Or, there was even a few people in our church that we were like, hey, I can't teach you drums, but the church would love to invest in lessons, or co-invest, that kind of thing. Just showing like, hey, we believe in you. We, want to help you in this way, but I can't teach you drums because I'm not a drummer. So
I love that. I love that you become more like a curator of training. Like, you don't have to create all the training, like you're saying. You don't have to teach the drum lessons or make the YouTube video. You just find it and send it. And I think that's such an easy, practical thing that anyone listening can do, like with almost zero effort, and hopefully see some results. One of the things I learned from Hillsong was just that they basically set such a strong expectation on their musicians that God deserves your best, and God deserves you to keep growing and keep improving. And they do a lot of training, but they also expect people to work on it on their own. And there's just this strong expectation that that's like not even negotiable. Like you will be improving because God deserves your best. And I think even just casting that sort of conversation into the mix does help people go, okay, yeah, Alex or Andrea is helping me grow. Yes, I'm watching these videos to grow, but I'm working on it because I want to bring my best to the Lord. And so it's almost, it's not just like, hey, do this, but it's like, hey, think this way. And that's been kind of helpful for me as I, try to lead my musicians as well here.
Yeah.
You said the third thing on the questions list that you get is like limited resources. So you had mentioned the drummer, we're going to co-invest in you. Obviously some churches, like that's not even an option. So what are some of the issues where you're having these churches ask you like, hey, we have limited resources, we have limited people, we have limited money? What are some of the problems you see there?
Yeah, well, I think it kind of comes back a little bit to what you were just saying about being willing to invest in yourself. And kind of one of my mantras is that we don't pursue excellence so that people look at us. We pursue it so that they're not distracted by us, so that we're just like a pass through to the Lord. And so I think that one of the things as I'm working with churches, as they're saying, hey, we don't have the money, we can't pay for lessons or we can't buy XYZ. At first, instilling in the team members like, hey, we want to help you how we can and we will, but you have to have some like ownership in this too. Because like you were just saying, it's got to come from that place of, I want to be the best that I can be for the Lord and for honoring him. And so I come at it starting there just because I think that's so key and so important that the team members in the church feel that ownership with it and like, okay, I'm going to do this. But as far as how to help them when they don't have the resources, it's kind of like what I was saying, just looking for things that are available and that are really reasonable. So, if you want to use multi-tracks, but you can't afford whatever the platform is, whatever, I think I use multi-tracks as a blanket term for tracks in general, then start looking for ways that are more reasonable or affordable in your budget. Like you said, core sound pads. I love core sound pads. Mike lives in Minnesota actually, and he's an Overflow partner too. So, stuff like that, it's really reasonable. And usually the church can find the $19.99 or whatever it is to invest in something like that. There's a worship leader at a local church in our area, and she was talking to me about like training up the youth leaders, and they don't really have a budget, and she kind of plays some drums, but it's limited. And so she was just researching resources that were reasonable online for stuff they could read, videos they could watch, songs they could learn and, kind of mimic and play along. And it didn't really cost them very much at all, but it took the worship leader taking that initiative to seek it out. And so that's something that I guess, I try to encourage leaders as well. Like, hey, just see what's out there. Start researching things, because you'll be amazed at what you would find once you start looking and what is reasonably priced or free, really.
Yeah, I think, like you said, research is so key because there is so much out there that's free or cheaper than you would expect. Like you can get decent in-ear monitors now. Like you could set up a little headphone amp, with 4 different sends, and like the headphone amp's $40 and the in-ears are $20 each or something. Like it's crazy cheap, and it's not going to sound the best, but like, hey, if that's something you want to do and you're like, I couldn't see a huge reason why a really small church would need in-ears, but I'm just saying like, if you research, you can find a way, and it just takes the leader having that initiative to be like, okay, let's go digging and see what we can find.
Yeah.
What about like, if people had, let's just say a budget of like $1,000 a year or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's even a lot for some people listening, I'm not sure. But how do you prioritize what's going to make the biggest impact? And I'm sure it's different for church to church, so I'm not sure how you'll answer this question. But like, how do you figure out like this thing will make the biggest difference this year if I invest, $600 of the dollars into this? And then how do they prioritize that? Like, what should they be looking at or thinking about as they come at expenses?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think it has to start actually from a more global and like vision casting perspective. So thinking about what is your vision for the worship ministry and really the church has to start there. So talking with, your leadership, if you guys don't have a vision statement or goal set for the year, you got to start there, because otherwise you don't have a filter to run things through. And like you say, you're kind of shooting in the dark a little bit. Like, sure, let's spend $20 here and $50 here. And you might get to the end of the year feeling like, what did we even purchase this year that was beneficial to us? Because it just felt random. So I encourage listeners to really start from that global perspective. Talk to your pastor, talk to, whomever you do in your context about, okay, what's the vision for the next year? What are the goals for the worship ministry? Maybe you're going to invest in some multi-tracks and some equipment that allows you to use technology from the stage, because you want a resource from within. And so if you're missing pieces, missing instruments, then that would be a great route to go, and then kind of pinpoint your pain points. I like to say that a lot, like if it's tons of stage noise and always issues with monitors not loud enough, well, then you might need to look at in-ears. And like you said, for very reasonable, you can get the cheaper wired headphone amps, and then at least you can try it and you haven't spent, $10,000 on something that you're not sure you're going to like. So right. That's how I would approach it.
That's really great. And I think, like you said, what are the main issues that are plaguing us on a continual basis? And can we solve those for cheap? I also think what I'm realizing more and more is the best investment is investing in the training of your people, because you could buy a really cool keyboard, and if nobody knows how to utilize it to the full potential, it's a waste of the keyboard and it's a waste of the money. You could have a pretty lame keyboard, but if you train your people how to play well, they're going to bring out the best out of that keyboard. Or it could be, apply it to the sound console. Okay, you could spend $3,000 on a digital sound console, but if you've got a guy who literally doesn't know how to use it, that's a waste. Why not train him to learn how to just do sound in general with the console that you already have? And then you're going to get a better return when you do upgrade your console. So I've found just recently more and more how important it is to invest in people. And it's I need to make more time in my schedule and in my employees' schedule to train our people in the things we need them to grow in, because that's going to pay great return.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when you approach it from the relationship standpoint and the people standpoint first, it kind of shifts the conversation and shifts the perspective a little bit. And I think that's really powerful.
Right. Now, talking about people, something that I didn't ask earlier, but I kind of want to ask now is, because you're limited on people, right? You kind of settle for behavior that you don't necessarily want to settle for. So for example, he's always late to rehearsal, but he's the only guitarist we have. Yep. How should we approach that side of limited personnel?
Yeah. And that's a great question. It is one that I get often. And I think it's hard because on one hand, like you said, well, they're the only person that we have. And then on the other hand, if anybody out there listening is like me, it's not like I want to make somebody feel bad or be the big mean person that tells someone they can't play anymore because they're not respectful of others' time. But I think that it comes down to being respectful of one another's time, being respectful of ministry, of leadership. And so anytime we bring a new worship team member on at the church that we've been at for the last several years, we kind of put in place this, I call it a policy, but it's not like they had to sign anything, but it's basically hey, this is what's expected of you. This is what you can expect when you come to a rehearsal. And this is we would lay it out. And that gives us something to stand on. Then when we come back around and say, hey, we're noticing that, for example, the guitar player who's always late to rehearsal. Well, we've been noticing that you're always late to rehearsal, and we understand that, you have a full-time job and you've got a family and, whatever, fill in the blanks. However, based on our conversation when you began in the worship team, that is what we expect of you. And we need you to work hard to be on time, because it's disrespectful of everybody's time and everybody's waiting for you. And, we love you. We want to do what we can to help you. But this is, that kind of gives us a framework to go off of. And then, when you come at it from the standpoint of the relationship and from the standpoint of, hey, we love you, this is what we're seeing and we need to address it. I think it changes the course of the conversation a little bit, as opposed to like, hey, stop being late. This is dumb. It changes the course of the conversation. But then if that person's like, hey, you know what? I can't be to rehearsal on time. I just can't do it. Well, then that's another conversation. Is it because they just don't want to, or is it because they literally can't? And then maybe you as an organization are saying, okay, well, could we all practice at 6:30? Sure. Okay, great. But if it's the other way, like they just don't want to be there, then you got to be okay to let them walk away and, say like, hey, we love you. We love you so much, but maybe for this season, this just isn't going to work for you. And those are hard conversations to have. But when you come at it from the perspective of the relationship and from the perspective of kind of this policy or guideline that you have in place, it gives you a framework to work with.
Yeah, I think that's great. And being not afraid to let people go who aren't in line with the vision and direction that you're feeling called to go, it can be scary because you're like, who's going to fill in that role?
Yep.
But that's where we trust, Lord, this is your church. You've called me to this. You're calling me to go this direction. And I'm going to trust that you're going to bring the people who will go in line with that direction. I think the trickiest thing is when you've inherited people,
yes,
or now you're changing the culture and you're changing the policy, which maybe some people listening now are saying, okay, I need to change. I need to put some clear things in writing and explain these things to our team, and we need to change where we're going. That's where it's really hard, because you haven't had those upfront conversations when they came onto the team. They've always been part of the team, and now you're going a different direction. I think the thing I would say to that, as someone who's recently been going through that for the last 3 years or so, is love, patience, kindness, graciousness, many, many times of conversations, loving conversations, forgiveness, knowing when to let it go, knowing when to not let it go. Because now you're taking somebody who has been part of an old system and you're trying to move them in a new direction. And like, you have to just be very sensitive about that. So that would be my advice on that. It's very tricky.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think like time, like you said, is so key. And I love what you said about knowing when to let it go and knowing when to wait. That's huge, because the goal is not to come in and be like, my way or the highway. That's not it at all. It's, it's to promote a healthy team. But, I would say when I came into a worship director position 14 years ago at a church that was already established, I mean, it was a few years of just little gradual things. And I was learning too. Like, let's be real. We're all learning together. It's not that there's one perfect way, but I think it's so key to take it slow and to follow kind of the need of the team, because you don't want to bulldoze over everybody either. But like you said, to be very loving and patient, because it's a huge thing and it's very important to do that.
Yeah, this has been super helpful. I want to talk about that one last thing that you mentioned at the beginning is, who are we supposed to sound like? Because I feel like that's a question a lot of churches are wrestling with. So tell us about the sound piece. Who do we sound like?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a lot of times I always tell people, you're probably not going to love the answer to that question, but it comes back to being willing to be excellent with what you have. And I think that there's just this misconception out there that whatever the recording is, that's what we have to sound like. And I've even heard things like, well, can we even do that song? We don't have a guitar player. And so it's just kind of taking that and turning that around and saying, well, yeah, you absolutely can. How about we just try it with the piano by itself? What does that sound like? And just kind of giving everybody out there permission to try it with what you have. It's not that, oh, this is only a guitar song or this is only a tenor song. I also get a lot of questions about key signature. How do we do this song, for a female when there's a song that has a tenor part that jumps the octave? Like, well, what do I do? So helping them find a key signature that works. All of those things, being excellent with what you have and learning to thrive in, the gifts that God has given your church body. So if that's, female singing leaders, then, you want to find key signatures that work and that are comfortable for the perspective of a non-singer. It's not too high, it's not too low. And then instrumentally, making it work with what you have and really understanding the role of your instruments in the band. So if you have a different setup every Sunday because that's what's available to you, and maybe it's just a piano one Sunday and then it's a guitar and a bass player the next Sunday, and it's just kind of, small pieces, that is okay. You can change the song to fit your context. Maybe you don't do the instrumentals. If there's a 24 bar instrumental, just don't do it because it's not going to fit within the context of one instrument or two instruments. So those are some of the things that I like to tell people and encourage them. Hey, God gave you this. You've got what he wants you to have. So let's thrive with it.
Yeah. No, and I love that you said cut the instrumentals, because that's like such a pet peeve where it's like, it's just the guitar player, but he's like trying to play the huge, massive riff. It's like, hey, it's not working,
Yeah.
And my friend Brenton Collier actually wrote an article like about 6 tips to, when leading with a small team. I'll put it in the show notes so people could check it out, because there are a couple other tips like that. And I just love what you said, like God gave you what you have to do what he wants you to do. And we don't all need to sound like Hillsong or Bethel. Those are great churches. Mm-hmm. But I think when you copy what God has called another church to do, you lose the power and the influence and the authority that God wants your church to have. And I feel like so many churches are just copying what they're seeing elsewhere, and it doesn't work as well as the church that was called to do it.
Yeah.
And it's so sad to see that. And so like in my context, we do use the album versions of songs as kind of the reference point, and like these are the lead lines for the guitar and for the keys, and this is the drum groove and even the drum fills. But if somebody comes in and approaches it slightly different, and it always does sound slightly different because every player is different, and those are the players that God sent to the church, and so like, for example, the way that I approach it is like, if a bass player, because I have a couple bass players who they play like a different style than I would play bass or whatever, or that I would prefer. And if they play it and they're doing kind of a different bass groove than what I want to hear, but it's not going to ruin the worship for the body, then I leave it alone.
Yeah.
I'm like, if it's going to be a distraction, or if it's really hindering the moment, then I will tell them, hey, please change it. But if it's like just a preference thing and it's still, the point still gets across and it's not a distraction, then I let them play what they kind of want to play in those moments, So if that's helpful for the listeners, that's kind of my approach to it. So this has been really helpful. I think people will want to connect with you, and I would encourage people, obviously you can hear how much wisdom Andrea has and the practical knowledge she has. So Andrea does trainings all over the Midwest area, and she has a conference now that has grown exponentially. So Andrea, what is the conference? When is the conference? Where is the conference? And how can people find out more about that and your ministry?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Overflow Worship Conference is in October. It's on October 11th and 12th, and it's in Wilmer, Minnesota. And, basically the premise of this event is that I just have a passion for the local church and for training worship teams and leaders. And so one of the questions that I was getting a lot was, how do we train our team members, right? Or help us train our team members. And so this conference is for the whole team. And so we have classes that are for, the guitar players, the drummers, the sound techs, all of those things. And it's very practical from an application standpoint, but there's also, spiritual and leadership training as well. And this year, joining me is going to be Meredith Andrews and her husband, Jacob Suter, and Todd Fields of Worship Circle. So, and along with so many other speakers and presenters for the breakout session. So it's going to be just a great weekend. Kicks off with a night of worship on the 11th, and that's open to the public. So we always tell people, like, bring your church, bring your neighbors, all your friends, because that's open to the public. And then Saturday, the 12th, is the sessions and conference workshop. So if you're interested in learning more about it, we would love to have you. And we do have some people who travel from, outside the Midwest to come, and it's just a great time. So if you want to learn more, our website is overflowworship.com, and that will kind of shoot you to wherever you want to go. If you want to get in touch with me personally, you can do that from that link as well.
That's awesome. And I'll link that in the show notes as well for people to have easy access to that. Do you have any final words for the listeners today, just who are leading in mid-sized, smaller sized churches? What would you conclude with?
Yeah, I just want to encourage all of you out there that, God's placed you for a purpose. He has you in this place for a purpose. And we don't always see or understand what he's doing, but he's got a reason for it. And I think a lot of times, we go through seasons in ministry and leadership where we feel overlooked or forgotten. And I just really believe that God wants you to know that he's still writing your story. He didn't forget, and he has a purpose for you where you are. And he's looking for us as worship leaders to be grateful for what we have, where we are, and to thrive with it and to let our roots go down deep. That's the conference theme this year, is deep roots. And so let those roots go down deep where you're at, and you will be amazed at what God does with that.
That's all we have time for today. I hope you were helped by today's episode. And if you think of anyone else who might be helped by today's episode, please send it to them and encourage them to take a listen. Just want to help as many worship leaders as possible grow in this craft and calling called worship leading. And if you have been enjoying the podcast, help us out by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts. Just say hello, give us a 5-star review, and share what you like about the podcast. And if there's anything else you want us to cover, we would love to hear from you. So thank you guys. I'll see you next month for another helpful episode. God bless. Bye.